Okay, people, welcome to this VIP event, and featuring Matthew Cole and Kate Stewart. Kate is going to give us a presentation, and then it's going to be followed by a Q&A. We're here to talk about their new book, Our Children and Other Animals, the cultural construction of human-animal relations in childhood. So obviously we're into sociology here. Kate is a medical sociologist working at Nottingham University in Britain, and Matthew works at the Open University. Their focus is the cultural transmission of social values, and they've been researching the subject of socialization and children for a number of years. You can find them in an AR Zone podcast from September 2013 and a recent podcast that they did with me, which goes under the name of On Human Non-Human Relations, or On Human Relations with Other Sentient Beings. Okay, Kate, thanks very much for doing this for us, and take it away.
Alright, you were cutting in and out a little bit there, so I'm just going to check that you can hear us alright still.
Yeah, it's good, yes, good, yes.
Okay, we're going a bit Norman Collier here and there, so hopefully we sound clear enough to you.
Yeah, well, there's a cultural reference that no one besides me will get.
It's flown straight over most people's heads, probably. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting us to talk about the book again. I'll talk through some of the key things that we cover in the book, just give you an overview of what we talk about and our approach to thinking about these different examples that we'll talk to you about this evening. So the book as a whole then focuses on the socialisation of the human use of other animals. So not only as resources of food, but resources for food, but also as resources for clothing, sport, entertainment, scientific research, and so on and so forth. Specifically, we're looking, of course, at the context of childhood, and we're specifically looking at the contemporary West as well. And I suppose the key question in the work that we've been doing over the last few years is how is it that most of us are brought up to accept and reproduce these uses of other animals? So the book then focuses on the socialisation, as I say, of the human use of other animals. We're doing this by looking at the interconnection of dominant practices and dominant representations, and how children, not only how children are important, how animals are important in children's lives, but also how children are important in other animals' lives, in their lives and particularly their deaths as well. So we do this firstly by looking at some dominant practices through which children encounter other animals. The feeding of animals, animal foods in infancy, selective exposure of children to so-called pets, so-called zoo animals. And secondly, we look at an analysis of dominant representations of other animals in children's culture, in literature, film, toys, games, clothing, and so on. And on this slide that you're seeing here at the moment, we've got a few examples of the kinds of things that we looked at in our work for the book. We look at toys and play. You've got the floor plan of Hamley's toy shop there. I'll come back to Hamley's in a little bit. Pets and pet clothing and the parallels between that and children's clothing as well. Educational initiatives such as the raising of animals by schools for slaughter and consumption. The picture that you have here is of the sheep that was bought and raised by a primary school called Lid Primary School in the UK. Fast food tie-ins, which is where our interest in this area really began. That was kind of what sparked off all of this. And some of you maybe have read our paper before that we wrote about fast food tie-ins. Healthy eating advice that communicates that animal products are necessary in children's diets. This example that's in the middle here is from a government-sponsored website which teaches children about healthy eating, about how to put together a healthy, balanced packed lunch. And when we looked at this, we tried to make a vegan packed lunch on this, and it was actually possible to do it because you could have hummus as a sandwich filling in your packed lunch. But when you got to the end of it, this warning came up. I don't know if you can read it on the screen there. What it says at the bottom, you've not got any cheese or yoghurt in your lunchbox. Remember to add some next time. So how things like that, how those sorts of resources reinforce the necessity for animal products in the diet. And then also we looked at the little screen grab that's down the bottom there, the structuring of the appropriate use of different kinds of dead non-human animals for use in school science in educational guidelines, which is what that's a grab of there. So as I say, by doing this, we're arguing not only for the sociological importance of other animals in children's lives, animals are everywhere, but to a very great extent hidden in plain sight from the perspective of mainstream studies of childhood, but also, as I say, the importance of children's socialisation in other animals' lives and deaths. And on that first point, that hidden in plain sight point, I don't know if any of you have seen today the BMJ paper that seems to have been quite popular. BMJ, always, British Medical Journal, always around about Christmas time, publishes some kind of quirky research, some sort of light-hearted stuff. And one today has been about children's films and the death toll, basically, in children's animated films as compared to adult films. Goes through the entire paper, barely mentioning that most of these deaths that occur in these are of representations of non-human animals. But that's just as an aside, if any of you have seen that story today. So in this book then, I'll talk you through how we went about this analysis that we did. We applied this conceptual map of practices and representations, which again some of you may have seen before or may have seen an earlier version of that we published with before. So these are the practices and representations that construct the meanings that we attach to other animals and our experiences of them in our culture. And these practices and representations therefore also profoundly shape the life and death experiences of those animals, depending on how we as humans position them according to these concepts on this map. And this map helps us think through how different practices, different representations can shift and interact in different contexts. When we first worked with and developed this conceptual map, we did it with a kind of a compass in the middle, and I think the helpfulness of thinking of it in that way is not, we're not focusing necessarily on the positions of these bubbles that are around this map here. They're not fixed positions. We're focusing on the pull of these different axes. And in terms of what those axes represent here, along that equatorial line there, we're referring to the extent to which we construct other animals as exploitable objects or as autonomous subjects or agents, perhaps. That other line, the other axis there, the meridian, the extent to which different types of animals are sensible, that is, visible, audible, etc., in our culture. In earlier versions of this, we talked about visibility and non-visibility, but we've opened that out now because it isn't just about whether we hear or not, whether we see or not. It's about whether we also hear, whether we smell. All of our senses are involved in our awareness of how other animals are being used and represented. So we talk about sensibility and non-sensibility now. And the basic theme here is that we tend to encourage attention and affection on those who need it the least, the relatively protected companion animals or cultural representations of animals or the body parts of dead animals, and not those who need it the most, those who are exploited or exterminated in like, if you like, the southeasterly zone of this map. And to illustrate this with an example, it comes up with the next one. To put this a little bit more simply before we put the example on there, broadly speaking, these tensions across these two axes give us four zones, roughly speaking. The relatively privileged, but by no means unproblematic, northwest area afforded most subjectivity and sensibility. The southwest region, occupied by comparatively free-living or wild animals. The northeasterly zone of products of our dominant practices, and in the southeast death zone, if you like, where non-humans become those objects or are removed from our worlds, such as vermin, I snakes and vivisected animals down there. So hopefully here comes the example of this. So if we think about rabbits, who are ambivalently, problematically positioned in our culture, here they come. This shows that these meanings and experiences are constructed, they're artificial. They're not natural consequences of anything to do with either with the rabbits. The rabbits themselves don't identify themselves in these terms at all. They're all to do with how we use and think about rabbits according to these different axes. So at the core of a lot of the work that we've been doing is this, conceptually, in these different elements. We also, in the book, discuss the ways in which the experiences of children and non-humans were intertwined with the social and spatial reorganisation that accompanied urbanisation and industrialisation. So the physical and conceptual movement of both children and non-human animals, and both of these linked to concerns that were couched as moral or public health concerns. So here the importance of place and space, as well as how we represent and think about other animals and children, where we place them as well, where the appropriate place for both children and for non-human animals are, and for the appropriate places for the interactions of those two groups as well. So these pictures that you see along the bottom here, during that period of rapid urbanisation and industrialisation, the removal of children from the so-called inappropriate workspace to the appropriate school space, and similarly the removal of non-human animals from urban livestock markets, shambles, places of slaughter in the city centre, to appropriate places for non-human animals to be seen and encountered, such as city zoos, which flourished all around about the same time. And what we argue in the book is that these processes and how we shifted conceptually and spatially what we saw as appropriate for children and what we saw as appropriate in terms of non-human animals are entirely interlinked, they're entwined. And this quote from an article written, I think for Strand magazine by Charles Dickens, we think kind of illustrates this very much. You shall see the little children inured to the sights of brutality from their birth, trotting along the alleys, mingled with troops of horribly busy pigs, up to their ankles in blood, but it makes the young rascals hardy. Into the imperfect sewers of this overgrown city, you shall have the immense mass of corruption engendered by these practices, lazily thrown out of sight, to rise in poisonous gases into your house at night, when your sleeping children will most readily absorb them. And very much when we looked at this, when we found this little extract here, this notion of poisonous gases being readily absorbed by your children, certainly struck a chord in terms of perhaps how we think some of these representations and practices get to work on children in contemporary society. So we set that scene really with both our kind of theoretical approach, that conceptual map, and this historical perspective. We set the scene in the first part of this, in the first part of our book, covering those issues. In the second, in the middle part of the book, we have a look at different socialisation sites, and I'm going to talk you through some of the examples of some of the material we looked at from each of these four sites. So we looked at family practices, so things to do with clothing and food. We looked at mass media, so representations in films aimed at children, cutie magazines, which is what the picture on the right there is, that cultivate affection for certain kinds of animals. Formal educational resources, I'm going to come and talk to this educational resource Farmland, which is depicted at the bottom in a second. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And we also looked at digital media as well, so games like the farming games that you get on Facebook, those sorts of things. So the first of these sites then is the family and the practices that are most closely associated with the family. And as I mentioned earlier on, we had a look at Hamley's. This is the floor plan of Hamley's toy shop in London, and this illustrated a lot of these themes really well. We talk about Hamleys for quite a while in the book. Excuse me. So part of the achievement of the socialisation process is to associate affective attention towards other animals with human infancy. And as children age, affectivity is progressively attenuated and gives way to the inculcation of instrumental rational action. So what we see in terms of the kind of ageing that's represented by the rising through the floors of Hamleys is that you start on the bottom floor with cuddly toys for infants, and they gradually give way to representations of animals that are progressively more realistic in terms of how they look, but they become less, there becomes much less affectivity involved in those representations. Instead, the non-human animals represented on the higher levels of the store for the older children are manipulable objects that are there to be posed in their appropriate locations, especially farms. And as you'll see here, this is a picture of a livestock transporter that you can buy, a toy livestock transporter that you can buy at Hamleys. So they almost become, the non-human animals there almost become props in order to play with the settings, rather than these much more kind of subjects, focuses of affection that the cuddly toys are on the ground floor. If you go up a flight again, children can consume animal products in the form of milkshakes, in milk chocolate, gelatine and sweets. So literally, as you rise to the very top of the floor, that consumption becomes real, rather than just represented or figurative. So Hamleys and many other examples like this also alert us to the instrumentalisation of children's affection for other animals. Commodified representations of animals and not real animals are highly visible lightning rods for children's affectivity. And the denial of exploitation that's facilitated by these representations is extremely profitable for both the culture industries that produce them and for the more directly exploitative industries that they so often associate with. We also looked in this chapter on the family at children's food and children's clothing as well, and how from the very first food that's produced by anyone other than a baby's own mother aimed at children, we see the kinds of imagery that we identify elsewhere coming through and starting. So, as in this example here, we see affectivity emphasised through the use of love hearts and cute animal imagery. All of the infant formula milks that are available in the UK, as part of their packaging, will contain imagery either with a love heart or with a picture of a cute animal, or, as in this example here, both of those. They're ubiquitous on all of these, as I say, all of these formula products. And then as we move along, as children get a little bit older and we're starting to introduce jarred baby foods, when you look at how imagery is presented on those, again as this example here, we see an emphasis of the animal product element of the supposed meal that the jar contains, that the name of the product aligns with a normal, a mainstream adult meal. And these are foods that actually the content of a food baby jar is a jar of baby food, is primarily rice and vegetables, and rightly so. A weaning child's digestion wouldn't be able to eat process terribly much else other than rice and vegetables at that age. They're introducing, these meals are introducing tiny bits of animal product. So there is beef in this cottage pie, but only a teeny tiny bit. But the imagery and the discourse of a meal based around an animal product is being brought in at this very young age, along with all of this very much gendered imagery about affectivity. Mum's own cottage pie is what's on offer here. Actually, no, this is a factory's mush of rice and vegetables. That's what's in the jar, accurately. So it's bringing in representations of something that aligns with these mainstream practices that rely on the use of non-human animals as food. So we also look at clothing, a couple of pictures for you here on this slide about clothing as well. And here we see the intersection of age, of gender and of speciesism going on all at once. So for young girls' clothing, we see imagery very much associated with the cottage garden, pastel colours, rabbits, butterflies, all of these kinds of things. Clothing for younger boys has bold colours, has animals non-human animals we'd normally think of in terms of being wild animals. He's just blowing his nose there. And as both of these groups age, as both boys and girls age, we see fewer and fewer non-human animals represented on the clothing, especially for boys. Again, signalling, identifying this socialisation process that we see reinforced in other representations elsewhere, that we associate a normal growing up with a moving away from these very strong affective connections with non-human animals. And you see that represented very strongly as you look at how a clothing catalogue ages. So we see both gender and age moved forward in how other animals are represented on children's clothing. So taken together then, our analysis of the family as a site of socialisation focuses on the initial cultivation of the value of expressing affection for others, through pets, through soft toys, all the while inculcating practices that depend on violence, on eating animals. So where we're seeing representations and practices very much above that equatorial line there, but what we're also identifying is a spatial reorganisation that we traced back through that historical process, as I said. So the domestic space is constructed as a secure refuge from non-human animal threats that dispute the human privilege of positioning other animals. So, for example, Matthew put this slide together and went a bit wild on the PowerPoint animation, so we've got foxes flying all over there. It is magnificent. He's looking a bit aghast. I think it's a magnificent slide, but there we go. Anyway, so this example of the demonised urban fox who invades from her or his proper location, which should be in that southwest region, attacks human infants, threatens the human family space, threatens and attacks companion animals who are thought to belong, like that little kitty there, in the human space. Even exploited pseudo-pets like backyard chickens as well. So space a very important feature in all of this as well. Second area that we look at, mass media, killing and cutification. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the area really where our academic interest in this first started to develop, we first started to work on. So we look at films and cutie magazines in the chapter in the book specifically. The Lion King we don't talk about so much in the book, but I'm going to mention it here because it's probably one of the key original inspirations, I suppose, for this book. And if Matthew wasn't feeling so grotty, he would now probably hold forth for about 10 minutes on all the things he hated about the Lion King. Do you want to talk about the Lion King, Matthew? Okay, and it'll probably make you feel better.
Yeah, I can't resist this one. As Kate said, this was one of the first things that got us thinking about the stuff that ended up in the book. And in the book itself, we talk more about Puss in Boots, which came out 3 years ago. But a lot of the themes came from us thinking about the Lion King. So I saw it at the cinema when it came out 20 years ago. About reminiscing nostalgically about when I saw the Lion King in the cinema and how much it affected me at that point as something, something ideological was going on there. And this is before, I might have just started studying sociology at that point, but I wasn't a sociologist or anything. I didn't have the conceptual tools to articulate what I was feeling, but I knew something was going wrong there. So when we came back to this topic all those years later, was it 15 years after that or something, when we started working on these ideas, I finally got my chance to have my revenge, my intellectual revenge on the Lion King. So I gleefully wrote about it in that paper from 2009. So some of the things that we thought were going wrong with it, Elton John is certainly responsible. Well, he didn't write lyrics, doesn't he? But anyway, he sang the song "The Circle of Life," and the whole idea of the Circle of Life, I thought, was just a justification for eating meat, really. So it's a way of smoothing over this uncomfortable truth that lions eat other animals for the children in the audience, to make that seem okay and non-threatening. But more than that, we thought this was also about making eating animals seem normal and natural for the children themselves when they're going to have their, Happy Meal tie-in burger after they've seen the film. And then there are a number of other things going on in the film that sort of fitted in with that way of looking at it, we thought. So, for instance, all the herbivorous or vegan animals, if you like, who are in the film are silenced. They don't have their own voices. They don't become characters in the same way as the carnivores, especially the lions, of course. And the actual processes of killing animals and eating meat aren't shown on the screen. It all takes place off stage, as it were. The only small reference to meat eating is when the hyenas are depicted. Well, again, this happens off stage, out of sight, but it's discussed that they're going to be eating meat. And so there's this process of identification between the audience and the carnivorous animals that gets put in place within the film. So the vegan animals are, uninteresting. They're presented as a mass, so you get a stampede of wildebeest, for example. So the outcome is that meat eating is seen as natural and just and normal and unproblematic and all that kind of thing. So, and we think this goes on in, certainly any of the Disney type films that we've watched that have animal characters, and of course there is a huge amount of them. So as I say, in the book itself, we look at Puss in Boots in a similar light and critique that in a lot of detail.
So you're returning to your sick boat now. Or do you want to talk about animal cutie magazines as well?
Well, okay. Guilt tripping me. But, excuse me. So this, in this chapter, where we focus on mass media, sort of half of it is looking at Puss in Boots in particular and films in general, and the other half is looking at this genre of magazines that we call cutie magazines. I don't know if you have something similar in Ireland, or maybe even these titles might be available, I don't know. But in the UK there are 4 of them that we found that are very, very similar, and they're called all about animals, Animals and You, Animal Cuties and Animal Friends. And they're all targeted at pre-teenage girls, very, very firmly not targeted at boys from the excuse me, imagery and so forth. And they all share a number of things in common, which we've tried to sum up in these bullet points on the slide. So there's a lot of anthropomorphism, so a lot of the animals have kind of speech bubbles and they're saying things to the reader. There's a lot of infantilism. By that we mean the animals, nearly all the animals in the magazines are baby animals, infant animals. And there are these common motifs of sugar and hearts and flowers, this sort of girly, stereotypically girly imagery. So what we're arguing is that, taken as a whole, these magazines reinforce this idea of cuteness, both through representations and also through practices. And to illustrate that, we've got a few quotes from some of the magazines here. So there's one feature that says, who wouldn't want one of these super cuties as a pet? They're gorgeous. So that goes next to some photos of some infant animals. So it's inviting the girl readers to participate in that practice of pet keeping. And then secondly, draw a cute picture or send in photos of your gorgeous pets. So inviting girls to participate in transforming other animals into representations, cute representations. And then finally, this cutie kitten wants someone to tickle its tummy. So with those kinds of examples, the animals themselves are kind of made complicit with this process and presented in such a way as to make it seem perfectly natural that pet keeping is the natural order of things, if you like, and that's what one should do with these types of other animals. So, in terms of our conceptual map, the attention of the reader is directed to these safe zones conceptually. It's focused on, or as we've summed it up with this alliteration, kittens, cartoons, cupcakes and conservation. So you can see it. Again. So you can see that being summed up on this slide here. So the animals in these different zones are kind of drawn together in these magazines, and at the same time the products of objectification, of exploitation, are also made highly visible. So we've used a cupcake with the love hearts on it to represent that. Because another common feature of the magazines is that they have recipes for cakes and biscuits, sugary foods, and these ubiquitously include animal products, of course, hens' eggs and cow's milk and so forth, gelatin in sweets. Though some of the magazines have free packets of sweets, which include gelatin given away, stuck to the front cover, that kind of thing. That's a snow leopard in the bottom left, coming up from the sort of southwestern corner. One of the magazines featured a flyer, an insert for the World Wildlife Fund. It's an appeal for the Amur leopard, and I noticed there's also been TV adverts recently about this same appeal, asking for people to donate for conservation, of course. And the incentive for supporting the effort is you get a free cuddly toy, you get a free cuddly snow leopard, who actually looks very, very similar to this one in the picture. So again, it's the cuddly infant version that is the version that hooks in people's sympathy, because that's what they've been accustomed to through all this other stuff that's been going on in these magazines, in the Disney films, in children's clothing and so forth, and also in schools, which occasionally...
Oh, nice! Nice link, Matthew. He's just going to hook himself back up to his drip now. I'm going to talk to you a little bit then about the next chapter, where we talk about education. Perhaps somewhere one might hope to find a more sober account of human, non-human relations. But in fact, the educational materials that we looked at recalls and reinforces the lessons that children have learned so far in the home and the mass media. And nudge children, provide another way in which children are nudged towards acceptance of exploitative practices. And one of the examples that we look at in the book is this game and set of resources called Farmland. It's an online video game which was developed by the European Commission, claims to educate children between the ages of 9 and 12, about animal welfare on a livestock farm. That's its stated purpose. And the website, when we first analysed the game, the website was translated into 9 European languages. It's been translated into many more since we first did our work on it. And it's produced with support from the Directorate General for Health and Consumers. There's a coupling of interests there. The Directorate General for Health and Consumers. So, the game and the information that comes along to support the game also has things like downloadable materials for school teachers and pupils to use as well. So there are lesson plans and the resource books and workbooks and so on. How the game works and how the resources work first of all, there are a series of web pages that prepare children for playing the games in which they take charge of this virtual livestock farm. And this here is the page for laying hens, together with a picture of Berenice, who is the human who is in charge of the chicken run. I'm not going to dwell on it too much here. The imagery of the humans depicted, but please do note it as well. And in fact, when we first analysed this set of resources, Berenice was very scantily clad. She's covered up as more countries have become involved in farmland. She used to wear cut-off jeans, and she used to have a kind of tied white shirt crop top as well. She's covered up much more now, but still there are some there's some really gendered imagery that runs through this. And there are similar pages that run through pigs, broiler chickens, dairy calves, dairy cows. And on all of these pages, the messages that come along in the text emphasise the food functions of the non-human animals, that's what these non-human animals are for, but also the necessary guardianship of them by the farmers, that's for the non-human animals' own good. And we've drawn out from each of the different pages here, we've drawn out some of the examples where we feel that those elements are emphasised in the text that comes along with the material. We also looked at, in terms of this notion of guardianship, care and food being what these non-human animals are for, we also looked at schemes like the living egg hatchery programmes. I don't know if you're familiar with these, where schools can buy hatcheries with eggs in them a few days before the eggs are due to hatch. The hatchery is especially designed so that they have big viewing windows for the optimal viewing of the hatching eggs. And as you can see on this picture here then, the children can see the chicks hatch, and then after a couple of weeks, the chicks either remain the property of the schools and are raised on school premises, or are returned to an unknown fate, which all of these programmes are really quite vague about in the information they provide. They're returned to the hatchery company. And also, as I showed you the picture of earlier, these kind of care and kill school programmes where a non-human animal is raised on school premises and then sent for slaughter. And often in many of the examples that we looked at, the products are then raffled at the school summer fete, and so that children are encouraged to form a bond with these non-human animals. But it's with the purpose of showing them where their food comes from. There's never any questioning of, are these our food at all? There's never any acknowledgement that these children themselves might already be vegetarians or vegans. And actually these programmes don't show anything that children don't already know, that they're under the guise very often of showing children the full picture, of them knowing the full story about food production, but actually they cut out an awful lot of information, and they very specifically and very explicitly never reveal anything about that southeasterly killing zone in terms of our conceptual map. That's always kept away from the children in these programmes. So taken together, these kinds of educational experiences like living eggs and like farmland temporarily reposition other animals in the safer regions of our conceptual map, but the dominant exploitative practices go unchallenged and are in fact reinforced because any challenge to them, such as veganism, is largely absent from the socialisation process, so they disappear again into that southeasterly killing zone, and those products remain at the fore in terms of what is sensible. The final example that we're going to talk you through is these examples of digital games that feature other animals. Do you want to talk about these, Matthew, or are you feeling too ropey? Oh, I'm going to be stoic and talk about everything.
This chapter, like the mass media one, there's kind of two things we focus on. One of which are sort of handheld console games like Nintendogs, that kind of thing, which we weren't going to talk about tonight. But the thing we were going to focus on is the other half of the chapter, which are these digital social media games like Family Farm, Farmville. There's lots and lots of them that are quite similar, which some of you have no doubt have come across. And we thought there's a few interesting things, terrible things going on in these games. One of which is that they have this appearance of re-enchanting, as we put it, re-enchanting human relations with other animals by again, making use of this sort of cute anthropomorphised imagery, so everything looks very friendly and you know, mutually beneficial and that kind of stuff. But what's actually going on in these games, which anyone who's played them will know, of course, is that it's the instrumental use of other animals that's absolutely central to how they work. So if you can see the slogan on the left from Family Farm, it says, "Family Farm where friends become family," but we've added ... become money, because that's what's really going on. It's all about learning how to profit from other animals. So just some examples of how that happens. So these are screen grabs from Farmville 2. And all of these games, it's not just these farming games, this is now a very common model in the gaming industry, is that games are free to access, to download or to play online, but then they depend on people using real world money to purchase in-game rewards and you know, things that give you access to higher levels and all that kind of thing. So that's how Farmville 2 works as well. So in this top left we have this example, more hungry mouths to feed. Your herd is lovable, so that kind of cuteness comes through, but pricey. So with money you make from milk, you can afford to buy more animals. So it's you know, a very transparent celebration of the capitalist commodification of other animals. Reinvestment in the business means exploiting more animals. And in this second example, we get an intertextual link back to The Lion King, the cycle of farm life, which is very simple. It's the circle of life, of course. Crops and animals form a virtuous cycle that ends in coins. Let's go. So this is virtuous in the world of Farmville 2. You know, this is virtuous action, exploiting animals. And then this last example here, down at the bottom, we have an absolutely naked celebration of capitalism. Capitalism is king, they say, as it says at the end there. And another key feature of these games is that other animals, even though they're in this cute style, they are basically reduced to machines. So these screen grabs come from another one of these games called Family Farm. Excuse me. And you can, I hope you can see on your screen that a lot of these animals have got these sort of rictus grins on their faces. So they're shown as being perfectly content in their positions, but they absolutely stay in their positions. So in some of these games, the animals move around within confines of the ranch or the farm, but in Family Farm, they stay absolutely fixed in place. So you position them on your farm as the game player, and they stay there for all time unless you sell them. But they're perfectly content to do that, so without any kind of interaction with other animals, without their lives containing anything whatsoever other than eating the feeds that you provide for them in order to exploit their products. And the reason we put violence is invisible on the slide is because, well, it is invisible. So, for example, in this bottom right picture, you have the sort of brownie coloured cow, and you see there's a little white kind of cube next to it. Now that's supposed to represent a packet of beef. So if you feed pasture within the game to this cow, these packets of beef appear next to the cow, out of, just out of nowhere. And the cow just carries on munching away, contentedly in the pasture. So it's meat without death. It's like an absolute, it's the fulfilment of the fantasy of this whole, dreadful system. The violence is made completely invisible. And then the last slide on these games is the reinforcement of consuming animal products. So these are again from Family Farm. So hungry little Darryl there can already smell the salami and he's starving. So there are lots of kind of what do you call them, missions, I suppose, within the games where you have to produce certain products to get particular rewards. So in this case you have to produce, in inverted commas, salami and sell it. So, but not only is consuming animals normalised, also we get this impossibility of...
Oh, what have you done?
Sorry, I pressed the wrong thing.
don't know what you've done. Let's go back. They can still see that slide.
Yeah.
But
Okay, I'll carry on talking.
yeah.
So, you see in the other picture here, we have these different kinds of bread, and they're all made with eggs and milk. So within Family Farm, it's impossible to have such a thing as a vegan loaf of bread, which is, really bizarre. So not only do they normalise eating other animals, but they also perpetuate this idea that being vegan is, bizarre, weird, and in fact, more than that, impossible. So I'll just pause there while Kate gets us back on track with our technology.
We might have to whiz through. Hang on, there we go. It's alright, we'll be there in a sec. It's that one?
Yeah.
There we go.
Great.
There we go.
Thanks.
Alright.
So yeah, to sum up what's going on here, we have by transforming exploited animals into these cute representations, the focus is again elevated above this equatorial line, and also the products of exploitation themselves become highly visible, because by producing these commodities within the games, that's how you make profit, and that's how you expand your ranch and so forth and reinvest in the business.
Right. So in the final section of the book, so those examples come from that middle second section. In the third and final section of the book, we look at the destabilisation of the socialisation of these dominant human, non-human relations, and we look at vegan practices and representations. So these are practices and representations that aim for a reconstruction of children's relations with other animals, and include social support and advice for children and their carers. They include educational initiatives, supporting alternative mealtime practices, and vegan-themed children's literature. And the latter in particular is a big focus of our analysis in this part of the book. So in different ways, books like this, and there's a couple of examples on this slide here, Vegan as Love and Stephen the Vegan, which you may be familiar with, probably at least in one of those. So books like these then, in different ways, help children to resist the mainstream socialisation process by treating other animals as sentient, as having rich emotional lives, as having social and family bonds, or as being wonderful, mysterious and beautiful fellow earthlings. And at the same time, they dethrone humans from their position of privilege in that northwest section of our map, if you like. They encourage humility, compassion and empathy among the readers. And the power of this work is perhaps summed up in the media controversy caused by the publication of Ruby Roth's Vegan is Love book that's on the slide there. And I think mentioned before the article on the Daily Mail that in horror proclaimed that a book like this could easily scare a young child into eating vegan. And some of the other examples that you see on here, we've got Animal Aid School Speaker Scheme, we've got the Vegan Society's old book on feeding vegan infants, information on alternative packed lunches, but also we focus very much on children's own agency and children's own ability to see through these practices and these representations. That very few of us were raised as vegans, that whether we see through these as children, as these two magnificent men in the middle of the slide here did, those are my sons by the way, or whether we see through those representations later in life as adults, still we have the capacity to see through those things and reject them. So we conclude the book by addressing our shared responsibility to engage with alternative representations and practices, to refuse to perpetuate the great betrayal of children's capacity for empathy and love for other animals in this mainstream socialisation process. Vegan representation and practice can instead help children and eventually all of us direct our attention and care towards all of our fellow earthlings. And it can sometimes seem that these dominant practices and representations that we've given you a flavour of this evening conspire to construct a totalising, monolithic, invulnerable whole. And certainly there have been times when we've been doing this work where we've felt that and where we've felt disheartened in that way. But ultimately we reject that, and ultimately we drew and continue to draw hope and strength from children's own capacities to assert their own ethics of resistance, as I say, either while still children or beyond childhood, like the many of us who likely grew up exposed to these representations and practices, but who questioned and ultimately rejected them. So we hope our work reminds us of how precarious these processes are, not how universal and monolithic they are, how delicate they are, how important their sociological deconstruction is to dismantling them, and last but not least, how our children, figuratively in our use of that phrase in our title, and literally on this slide, as I say, those are my children there, how our children themselves can and do see through these constructions and can and do reject them. So in that spirit, we're going to end this talk with a quotation from Donald Watson, who we all know, one of the founders of the Vegan Society and coiner of the word vegan in 1944. And in this quote, he reflects on witnessing the slaughter of a pig as a young boy, and he demonstrates what can be achieved by one child's contestation and refusal of this socialisation process. The thing that shocked me, along with the chief impact of the whole setup, was that my Uncle George, of whom I thought very highly, was part of the crew, and I suppose at that point I decided that farms and uncles had to be reassessed. They weren't all they seemed to be on the face of it, to a little hitherto uninformed boy. And it followed that this idyllic scene was nothing more than death row, a death row where every creature's days were numbered by the point at which it was no longer of service to human beings. And quite early in life I came to the conclusion that if I was to report on man's progress, I had to settle for the comment beloved of school teachers, could do better. And from that, the Vegan Society was formed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.